Welcome to Asian Book Club, where we highlight Asian and Asian American authors. We are your hosts,
Jamae and Sabangan.
and I'm Stephen Park, and we're here with our first read of Crazy Rich Asians by Kevin Kwan. Now, in this book, I think one of the most obvious things about it is that the word rich is involved,
Mm-hmm.
and not only rich, but crazy rich. And it's going to be something that we're going to deal with in terms of what we get later on in the read, at least based off of the movie that we've seen.
Mm-hmm.
But my question to you, Jamae, is do you think money changes you? Because one of the things that's going to happen is that Rachel is going to enter this world that she's not familiar with, where she grew up with a single mother. They had very limited resources, into a world that is Nicholas's, that is lavish and abundant and fully fulfilling the idea of being crazy rich. So, do
Mm-hmm.
you think money changes you?
Well, personally, I don't think money changes a person. I think it augments whatever a person already feels and believes inside.
So, do you think there are a lot of people out there right now that if they had more money, they would become a worse person?
Not necessarily. I think, and I'm thinking about the US in particular, if people were given more money in order to live, in order to survive, I think there would be more ease, but not a lot of worsening personalities.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that was the whole situation with the pandemic and the $2,000 and the when I forget what they're called, like the stimulus
The stimulus check.
stuff. Yeah, like they were meant to help people just get enough money that they can survive. And honestly, in the big scheme of things, after inflation, it really isn't that much to have $2,000 for some. For others, it means a lot more, but it kind of evens the playing field.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that that's where I'm thinking. I'm thinking more a stimulus check of $3 billion. Like, does
Mm-hmm.
that change somebody?
I think so. I stick to what I said. I think that if someone is totally money obsessed, then their personality may quote unquote worsen. But if a person truly is thinking of the world at large and thinking about just caring for their own well being in order to live, I don't think money would worsen that particular person.
I do feel like it makes people worse.
Mm.
I think it may be the fact that it augments what they already have. But if you're living in a society next to people, we tend to be kinder. I think seeing people face to face, being within the community, makes people realize the communal nature of living
Mm-hmm.
and understanding what it takes to be a part of a village or a part amongst people that are with you. I think if a person gets a ton of money, at least what I'm thinking in a general basis is that a lot of people will tend to dissociate from their communities and their societies, and they'll create like this mansion on top of a mountain, or they'll go off to a beach house, or they seem to separate themselves from the general population. And so maybe after a little bit of time, they still might not have changed, but after a lot of time, I think they start to lose track of what's actually happening in the world. And I think that's what we're getting with this billionaire population that's been going up with this end stage capitalism. So I don't think it's money in itself. I don't think it's items in itself. I think it's what the money does to separate you from the people next to you and create a lack of community and just a lesser understanding of being a part of a bigger thing, which is kind of what you were saying.
For sure. That's a big possibility of losing your humanity when you're separated from other people. Another thing that came to mind is money trauma. Money trauma can definitely exacerbate whatever situation the person may be in. So, like, maybe they do get $1 billion in their life, and the money trauma that they have is hoarding. So, they might hoard the money instead of giving to mutual aid, they might keep it to themselves and not really spend it at all. Or if their money trauma is about spending it because of scarcity mindset, if you don't spend it now, then you might lose it, then that also might be a situation that makes their habits worsen.
Right. Kind of like Scrooge in the Charles Dickens book, or like a lot of different tropes of a rich person becoming miserly, even though they grew up poor.
Right.
Right. I feel like at this point, I don't know how much it matters. I feel like In a very bleak sense, the middle class is disappearing and money's going one direction and money's leaving the other
Uh,
direction. But, there's still the lotto. We could all be McMillionaires one day,
oh.
but very unlikely. However, if you do want to do something that may not necessarily involve money, but you want to support the people around you and don't want to worry about becoming a not so great individual, that is going to be something you can look at our recommendation for the week.
Our recommendation for the week is Malaya Movement. Malaya Movement is a political organization focused on human rights, democracy, and sovereignty in the Philippines. You can join as a member under a local chapter. There are many local chapters across the nation in the United States, and there's also a chapter in Canada. You can join as a member, you can participate in the various campaigns and networks they build, host, and sponsor. And you don't have to be Filipino to join or be part of Malaya Movement. You can be an ally. One of the campaigns that was recently launched by Malaya Movement is a network of US-based Filipinos in solidarity for a free Palestine, which is called Filipinos for Palestine. You can learn more about their work through their website at malayamovement.com and on Instagram at Malaya Movement. Malaya, Malaya Movement.
Yep, and that's going to be our recommendation for the week. Okay, so first read of Crazy Rich Asians, and we don't know anything about the book yet because this is our first read.
Mm-hmm.
So this was chapters 1 through 11, and for anyone that has a physical copy, at least paperback, it's pages 1 through 92. Now, in this read, we're introduced again to a lot of people, which is my favorite thing. I am trying to keep track of everyone, and I think having watched the movies in the past makes it easier for me to actually visualize who they are. So now I'm at least visualizing the actors that I've seen,
Yes.
and it helps me be able to put a face to the names.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Because we watched the movies, I feel like it's a little bit of cheating because now we have reference.
Right.
But what's interesting is, I don't know if we mentioned this before, but there is a family tree at the beginning of the story.
Right. Yeah, there's a pretty extensive one that goes into the detail of the Singaporean families.
Mhm.
So ones that involve Astrid and then Nick and like the whole Young family.
Yes.
But yeah.
So having that as a reference as well has helped me at least
Mm,
figure out what the relationship is between each character, especially the cousins, which are Eddie Chang, Nicholas Young, and Astrid Leong. So when we start the story, we're first introduced to these cousins as their younger selves, where Eddie is this bossy older cousin, while Nick and Astrid are more of the ones who have to just tag along.
right. And we're introduced to them in what I thought was like a very eye-opening scene in terms of what the movie presented. And the book did a very similar thing where the family's stuck at a hotel, they can't get into the hotel, but then they use their money and their power to gain entrance and pretty much buy the hotel.
Mm-hmm.
And
And
I
the reason why they were kept out of the hotel was essentially racism.
Right. And I thought that was such a powerful image to say, we have so much money that in this white society, because I think it was the 80s or 90s, it
It's
was,
the 80s.
yeah, like Asian people weren't thought to have as much power. China was in a state where they were manufacturing, but they didn't have a ton of money.
Mm.
Singapore was just having been built. Singapore was just having been built. So this generational wealth that we're familiar with people in Europe having and people in early
Mm-hmm.
Americas having, like at least I, didn't really understand that Asian people also had this much wealth.
Fair.
It then goes into the scene where, like you said, like Eddie is bossing around the other two kids, and Nick is kind of just following along, and Astrid's in like the background.
Astrid is kind of fighting back. Like, why do I have to be this character to you, Eddie? And Nick is also like reasoning out, but not fighting back.
Right. And so that's kind of the first scene where we just get introduced to the fact that they have money.
Yes.
And then we go into more of the modern day and the situations that we're going to get in. So let's talk about Astrid, because there's a lot of description based around her, even an entire chapter based on who she is and where her money came from and what other people perceive of her.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's most of what we got is what do people think of Astrid, not necessarily who is Astrid.
Well, that we get a little glimpse of who Astrid is and why she does what she does. And although she is an heiress on both sides of her family, her mother's and father's side, she does use this money to have this shopping habit in which she leaves to Paris every few months, I think is what it said, in order to get these new dresses every season.
Yeah, so she goes every season when the dresses are coming out and the designers are working on them. But what I was thinking is she doesn't really have her own personality yet. Like she's still very mysterious. Like why does she go shopping? Like why is she addicted to the shopping? Like who is this person that's lying beneath? What we do know is that she has a husband, and her husband doesn't really come from money, at
No,
least not their kind of money.
right.
So he is more of a military guy. He has an outstanding record. She was in this relationship with this other guy. His name was Charlie. And Charlie came from a background of money. He was the kind of family that Astrid should have married into based off of probably what her parents wanted.
Right.
But then they had this weird falling out that I still don't really understand. They were engaged, they had everything planned out, and then all of a sudden they got into this fight that wasn't really explained.
No, and I think what that was showing, at least me, was that they were never really meant to be. Because there was also that scene where Charlie proposed to Astrid with a nice ring and she didn't want it, and so she threw it.
I think the opposite is I think that the introduction of Charlie just shows that this might be the person that Astrid was always supposed to be with because they have that childhood friend kind of relationship.
Hmm.
And there's probably a lot of love there. And I wonder if the mystery behind their breakup is something that's going to come back to us later and
Hmm.
get resolved by something being a misunderstanding rather than actually being a solid point of discourse that separated them.
Hmm. So you think that Charlie will come back somehow in this book?
Yes, because we also find out that Astrid's current husband, Michael, is a dick.
And he's a dick because he is cheating.
Yeah, at least based on the insinuation that we got, he got a text from a person. I think he's,
From a random number in Hong Kong.
yeah, and it was a sext.
Yes.
And Astrid saw this because she ended up seeing his phone and it was very apparent. So I don't think their relationship lasts based on the movie. Their relationship doesn't last.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that there's a point in this that we get back to Charlie with the early emphasis on Astrid, not only on her character and who she is and the whole clout behind her.
Mm-hmm.
We also see how big of an influence she is on Nick.
Mm, yes. And I think it's also because they're so close in age that they became such close friends outside of being cousins.
Right. And I don't know, they seem to care for each other quite a bit. They seem to
Yeah.
be each other's confidant. Even Nick's mom, when she's looking for Nick, ends up going to Astrid knowing that Astrid will have the details and be able to inform her at least on some amount of where Nick is,
Right.
which we'll get into as we talk about Nick's mom, Eleanor.
Mm-hmm.
But another character that we're introduced to is Eddie.
Eddie is also a dick.
Mm-hmm.
What we know about Eddie, at least in the chapter that focused on Eddie's character, is that he's very envious of those who are more well off, like his friend Leo Ming,
Mm-hmm.
even though he himself has riches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Leo's someone that he's constantly comparing himself to. In his chapter, one of the biggest things is Leo's closet and how much he wants the closet. He's also trying to make himself appear more wealthy with things like using Leo's private plane and trying to get
Mhm.
his family to the wedding. He very much so comes off as someone that's trying to flaunt the wealth. And
Yes,
I think the hardest part for him is that his parents do exactly the opposite. His
right.
parents, especially his mom, is just more thinking about keeping things the way they are, having emotional values to things like the original house that they grew up in. And
Mm-hmm.
it really frustrates Eddie.
Yes, and like, although the parents are wealthy, they don't really give this wealth to their children. They want their children to make their own money too.
Right, 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 right.
Which is what also frustrates Eddie because Eddie feels like they could look and live better lives without having to quote unquote struggle to get the money.
Right. So, along with Eddie, we're introduced to his brother, Alistair, who has a Hong Kong actress model girlfriend that
Yeah.
he's obsessed with. And
Mm-hmm.
then he has his sister Cecilia, who, amongst all of them, they seem a little bit eccentric.
Yes. In the chapter where the Changs are introduced, they're meeting together for lunch at one of the exclusive clubs in Singapore. Eddie is the last one to come in. Cecilia, on the other hand, is more focused on correcting her husband and not really paying attention to her son. And finally, like we said, Alistair is very Kitty obsessed, and Kitty is the girlfriend where he has no other thoughts of.
Right. But the thing that the Changs have is this exclusive invitation to the Ku wedding, which seems to be everything that's revolving around this story. It's also the thing that's going to eventually draw in Rachel to Singapore.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be the reason why Rachel is introduced to all these people that we're introduced to, as well as Nick's mom, Eleanor Young.
Mm-hmm. Who do we want to talk about first? Nick, Eleanor, or Rachel?
Let's go for Eleanor first.
For sure. Eleanor is Nick's mom, and what we get from the story is that she's very critical of Nick, critical of what he's doing, critical of the fact that he's not keeping her in the loop.
Which is standard, typical Asian mom things.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah, Eleanor is very resourceful. She's figuring out ways that she can figure out what's happening with her son. Because on the other side of it, Nick hasn't told her anything. He hasn't told her when he's coming. He hasn't told her if
Mm-hmm.
he's going to stay with her. He hasn't told her that he's going to bring a girlfriend to stay with them the entire time.
Right.
So I think it's less of an Eleanor issue. It sounds like a lot more of a Nick issue, which is, I don't know. In this read, he comes off a little bit more as a spoiled kid. Maybe not spoiled,
Mm-hmm.
but there are aspects of it where he's still a kid rather than someone who's so poised and knows how to navigate the world so correctly.
Fair. So when I think about Nick and Nick's characteristics in this story, he seems to be ambiguous in social situations. He doesn't know, specifically with his mom, he doesn't know how to break the news that he has this girlfriend. With another scene, he does not know how to tell Rachel about his family.
Right.
So I don't think he's trying to be malicious. I just think he's very uncertain.
Right. And I think that's where I think of like the spoiledness coming into play
Mm,
is that he is able to get away with it because
right.
he's been able to get away with it.
I think he gets away with it because of his charm.
I mean, money also brings in a lot of charm. I think a lot of people know who Nick is because of the young money.
Right.
But yeah, he's also probably very charming. I mean, we see that when he's first introduced to Rachel and their first meeting and how he is able to charm her over.
Hmm.
But I think the qualities of Nick that carry over the most is that he does seem very humble.
Yes.
He does seem like his intentions aren't necessarily focused around money, which is very different from Eddie. And
Hmm.
even I would say Astrid, who,
Right.
goes shopping and utilizes that money often. Nick is much more seemingly interested in the world and kind of trying to figure out what the world has to offer.
Right.
Because honestly, I don't know what I was thinking when I was watching the movie, but I didn't realize that Nick had a job when he was in the States.
Right. And I think that's also something that's different from Astrid and Eddie is that Nick's job is a professor and professors don't make a lot of money.
Right. Yeah, it's also something that takes a lot of work. I think it's something where it's very down to earth and you kind of have to take your beating here and there.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're a CEO or COO of somewhere, you're gonna get people to grovel to you. You're gonna have people that are gonna want to suck up to you.
And do the work for you.
Right. Whereas I don't know how y'all treated your professors, but when I saw classmates and even me sometimes, when I got a bad grade, I was always going up to the professor and like asking for help and like, what did I do
Hmm.
wrong? Or why wasn't this? Oh my gosh, when tests are written incorrectly, and I don't even mean like there's a bad question, I mean like the professor will omit an is or an article or something. Like the students go crazy. Like all of a sudden their English is all messed up and then they start blaming the professor that they don't understand the question.
Right.
I would only assume that Nick has some of that same thing where,
Hmm.
he's gonna take a beating from being in the position that he's in,
Right.
and he doesn't necessarily need to be in that position.
Right.
So, yeah, I think it's interesting how he carries around his humility and also just the mindset of who he is as a person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which brings us to Rachel.
Right. Because ultimately, this is how Nick finds Rachel is by working in the same school.
Yes. Rachel, on the other hand, even though she's not necessarily ambiguous in social situations, she's very analytical and thoughtful.
Right. Which could stem from her job as an economics professor,
Mm-hmm.
but can also stem from her growing up in a single parent household, specifically with the relationship that she has with her mom and it being so different in that Rachel isn't coddled. She's not necessarily so taken care of.
Hmm.
She's much more of the person that had to grow and learn and develop with her mom likely having to carry so many jobs.
Right. She has this air of independence that probably came from how her mom raised her.
Right, exactly. So we are planning to get this collision of Rachel, who's very methodical, who's very much looking into situations and trying to figure them out.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, she's going to be meeting Eleanor, who is very resourceful, very inquisitive, and very critical of a lot of situations
Mm-hmm.
coming from the background that she does from being in this rich society of Singapore.
Definitely. So, based on the way that the story is set up, we're seeing this collision about to happen.
Right. And both of them are on the side where they have no idea what's actually going on.
Right.
So Rachel's being introduced to this world by stepping onto this plane into ultra first class where she has people waiting on her. She
Mhm.
has this bed, whereas normally we have a tiny lawn chair that we sit on in planes.
Yes.
And then we have Eleanor who has no idea when her son is going to come, doesn't realize her son is bringing somebody, and doesn't have any idea who this somebody is besides the rumor mill of everyone else in Singapore talking about this Rachel Chu.
But specifically from Cassandra Chung, whose gossip is usually very spot on and manipulating Astrid for answers.
Right. So we kind of leave off on that ending of Rachel leaving towards Singapore, Eleanor finding out a little bit of information of who Rachel is, and Nick kind of being stuck between all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Like we had discussed earlier, Astrid is in turmoil of her own where her husband may be cheating on her and she just found out. And Eddie's suffering from money problems of
His
thought.
own
Yeah,
making.
his own thought of money problems.
Mm-hmm.
So, what are your thoughts on this book so far?
I think that the book speeds by so quickly. I know that we keep saying that about every book that we've read so far,
Mhm.
but this book flows so well.
Right, right. I agree. The 11 chapters went by really quickly. The other part that I really enjoyed was how much depth they went into with each character
Mm-hmm.
without feeling like it was over analyzing.
Right.
I really appreciated finding out how deeply that relationship between Astrid and Nick seemed to go in terms
Mm-hmm.
of how they were each other's confidant.
Yes.
I thought it was very nice to include how Rachel and Nick had actually met and that relationship blooming from where Rachel didn't really think much of him at first. And yeah, being able to even see the side characters have a storyline of who Eddie is and how he's trying to show off all this money and be this big fish in a big pond kind of mentality.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really thought the details in this were very helpful, more so than I would say what I saw from the movie.
Mm-hmm. For sure, for sure. Are there any notable characteristics of the writing style that makes Crazy Rich Asians, the book, stand out from other fiction?
I think it's very casual. It's very
Mm,
nonchalant, and I think that's also what makes it easy to read.
definitely. For me, one of the characteristics that I super appreciate about this book, and which I think you might pick up on as well, is that the Cantonese, the Mandarin, the Hokkien phrases have footnotes.
Right.
Although it does at times pull me away from the story, it still gives more depth into what exactly they're saying.
Right. It also is seemingly much more Singaporean than anything else. It's
Mhm.
very much the language that is spoken and it's utilized in a way that is within the everyday speech.
Yes.
So it doesn't feel forced in a way. It just
Right.
seems like what they would say. And yeah, from my aspect of not knowing what these words are, I appreciate not only the definitions that were provided, but the context behind them and
Yes.
why this stuff is important and how the characters would be viewing these words.
Yes, absolutely. I still don't like the fact that they're italicized, but I do appreciate that they have the footnotes.
Yeah, I mean, the italicizations just tell me that it's a word that I won't know. Because otherwise, I might assume that it's English or some version of a French derivation of English or something like, oh, did I just not know this word? And then I'd have to search it up. But I think the fact that it is italicized lets me know that it is in a different language than the one that the book is written in.
But I think that the fact that there are footnotes already tell me that it's not a language that I would know. And speaking of, if it was a French derivation of a word, then I would still know that I didn't know it because there's a footnote.
Well, I mean, I'm just saying we don't know all the words that we don't know.
That's fair. Are there any issues that you found with the book?
Nothing massively. I think you have an issue with the book.
I do. So, when we were given the backstory of how Nick and Rachel met, the issue that I found was how, quote unquote, she saw herself as a self loathing Asian, how her friend Sylvia wanted her to be, quote unquote, colorblind.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's a character flaw or if it's just a necessary context to the story, but I didn't like that Rachel saw Nick as a quote unquote exotic exception to the rule.
You mean like the fact that he was British?
Not just British, but
Or,
Asian.
yeah, I guess not British, but he had the British version of the accent. He
Yes,
didn't have like the typical American English accent.
exactly.
I think with that scenario, I was also a little bit bothered, but I think I was more so bothered by her representation of giving up on Asian guys because it then put the stereotype around all Asian guys.
Right.
She gave up on what, like 50, 60, 70 countries of different people.
Like 100 countries.
Yeah, it's just it's a lot to give up on. And then to say that these 13 European countries are the ones that now I'm interested in, it
Right.
very much seemingly a version of self-loathing in terms of racism that I saw in Rachel.
Right. In addition, her stereotyping Asian men as only seeing her as an asset.
Right.
I don't feel like, I mean, I know everyone's experience is different, but I don't feel like that's the stereotype of all Asian men.
Right. In her defense, I think I do understand what she meant by when she was the only Asian at a party and there was a guy that would find her and, talk to her in a certain different way. But in my mind, when I found someone at a party where there weren't that many other Asian people, I would get excited and I think I would talk to them differently,
Mm-hmm.
but in a very excited version of it because I
Right.
really wanted to talk to that person because they were someone that I think that I shared familiarity with. Even if we weren't the same patterns of growing up, we didn't have the same history, at least from the very sense of, okay, maybe we shared these innate experiences of being somewhat poor because our parents came as first generation immigrants without a lot of money, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe having these different foods that people didn't really recognize as American foods and having different forms of trauma of growing up that we could have
Mm-hmm.
shared. So I think maybe from her perspective it might have been annoying if someone came to her with those issues, but I do think that that might be the American within the Asian American aspect of Rachel. And I
Mm.
very much can see that this was a real character trait that doesn't seem fictional. Seems like something that I would notice in people carrying in America as an Asian person.
Fair. Something similar that we saw in Disorientation.
Right. Rachel
Gotcha.
needs to read Disorientation.
Exactly.
So this is what we know of the characters so far.
Mm-hmm.
These seem to be the main ones that are introduced. There's also Pickling, which is Rachel's best friend that we have
Yeah.
a brief introduction into. There's some other people that we see that we haven't been able to fully discuss, but if they end up being a bigger part of the story, of course we'll go into it.
Absolutely.
But what do we have for our next read?
In our next read, we are reading on the physical copy, pages 93 through 169, or for everyone, we're reading chapters 12 through 18 of part 1 and starting chapter 1 of part 2.
Yep. And so that's going to be our next read, which is going to be read number 2 of Crazy Rich Asians by Kevin Kwan. If you have any thoughts or things that you really enjoyed, feel free to reach out to us. And how can people do that?
You can email us at asianbookclubpod@gmail.com or join the conversation on Instagram at asianbookclubpod.
Yep. You can also reach us at our website, which is asianbookclubpod.com, which has our bookstore where we have books that we've read in the past, books that we're currently reading, and books that we plan to read in the future.
And a great way to support us is to rate, review, and subscribe to the show.
Otherwise, make sure to be happy, be healthy, and read a book.
Ingat!
Bye.
Bye!